No, ale powiedział, że nie będzie aktorem.
One day he arrived and told us he wasn't going to be an actor. Instead, he'd study in secret to be a priest. We all tried to change his mind and told him he shouldn't waste his skills.
Marnować tych talentów, że...
Czyś ty zwariował. Ty masz talent. Ty możesz być aktorem.
One of the actors said, "Are you mad? Why do you want to squander the talent the Lord has given you? If you become a priest, you'll end up in a village somewhere teaching kids and listening to confessions from old women." And Karol replied, "No, I will be a priest. I will be a priest. I will be a priest."
Karol had found his calling and outgrown his teacher Jan Tyranowski. Instead, he looked to the leader of the Catholic Church in Poland, Archbishop Sapieha. After the invasion, the Nazis had outlawed any training of new priests. But the Archbishop was running a secret seminary from his residence.
Sapieha was a Lithuanian aristocrat who had been Archbishop of Krakow since 10-20 years, and he was really quite an extraordinary individual altogether.
Sapieha was a figurehead for Catholics all over Poland. He had remained when other church leaders had fled from the Germans.
He was a strong man who didn't fear the Germans. I'd say the Germans maybe even feared him. And Poles will always remember him as a great man who led the church through the hard times of the occupation.
In October 1942, Karol arrived at the Archbishop's palace.
Why now, Karol?
I feel a calling, a duty to the church to enter the priesthood.
You are quite sure?
Yes.
Are you ready with your heart and soul to stand up for our country? For truth and freedom?
Yes, I am.
Sapieha was educating a new generation of priests to take the place of those murdered by the Nazis. Karol would join the others in the Archbishop's secret seminary, all preparing for the future.
There was comfort in the fact that he was now surrounded by something close to a family. He was with a group of young men who were going through the same sort of thing as he was, and above them they had this great father figure, Archbishop Sapieha, who he admired enormously, and who was a rather aristocratic figure, a rather strong role model, and I think provided him actually with many of the ideas about leadership that he then embodied himself later on.
Students would come in to the Archbishop's residence for Mass, for academic instruction, for spiritual direction. They would be given academic assignments. Go master this book, go read this. They would come back for examinations.
It was vital to keep up the pretense of a normal life. All studying had to be done in secret. When the Germans did discover someone who was training with Karol, they tortured and killed him.
I could have been arrested any day, in the street, at home, in the quarry, and taken to a concentration camp. Sometimes I asked myself, so many people, young people of my own age, were losing their lives. Why not me?
Karol began to believe he was being spared for a purpose. A belief strengthened one day in February 1944.
Wojtyla was walking home from his job. He was hit by a German army truck. He was spotted by a woman who was riding by on a tram. who convinced a German officer to take him to the hospital, where it was discovered that he had broken his shoulder and had a concussion.
After the accident, Karol was cared for by neighbours. Maria Pozniak was 9 years old when he was brought to her home from hospital.
My grandmother looked after him once he came out of hospital. People are really surprised these days when I tell them the Holy Father slept on a fold-out bed in our kitchen. But that was the reality of war. There was nowhere else for him to go.
Surviving the accident took on a deep significance for Karol, whose faith led him to interpret his life in terms of providence.
To those who like to think of his life in providential terms, of course, that's part of the story. He was always looking for God's hand in history. And I think he saw the fact that he survived the war, the fact that he went through it as well and learnt the lessons that he learnt in the course of it. All of that he saw as building towards the mission that God had in mind for him. It was a confirmation for him of the role of providence in history.
This was not the first time he had come close to death. During his life, there'd been several such moments. As a child, a friend had pointed a gun at him, not knowing that it was loaded.
Stop it.
An inch to the right, and the bullet would have killed him.
I believe Providence spared me the most difficult experiences. And so my sense of debt is all the greater, both to those I knew and to those I did not, who helped make my priestly vocation a reality.
And before the war ended, his sense of providence would be further strengthened. By the summer of 1944, the tide had turned against the Germans. On D-Day, the 6th of June, the Allies landed in Normandy. And on the Eastern Front, the Russians, now fighting with the Allies, were forcing the Germans to retreat. All over Europe, hopes of liberation were growing. In Warsaw, on the 1st of August, the Polish resistance rose up against the Nazis in a bloody fight for freedom.
The Warsaw Uprising was a really extraordinary event. Young men and women in the capital, Warsaw, holding out against the might of the German army, badly armed for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the Germans were quite frightened, I think, because the resistance, the uprising, took them by surprise, and the Poles fought very bravely and were able to hold them off for quite a long time. And so their reaction was, in Krakow, to make sure nothing like that happened there, and to pick up a very large number of young men in a single day to make sure that it didn't happen. And clearly part of the point was that, to be deliberately terrifying.
Komm jetzt heraus! Komm jetzt heraus!
This wave of German reprisals was fiercer and more extensive than anything the people of Krakow had known before. The day became known as Black Sunday. The Nazis were determined to capture any young man who might be a threat.
The Gestapo started searching house by house for young men who they rounded up, loaded onto trucks and took away. 8,000 people were arrested and taken to the camps. Many of them died. It was a huge shock.
Karol was at home when the roundups began.